Once you have your studio set up and you know what you're going to podcast about, it's time to create podcast number one. And this is where people often have trouble. Like many other things in life, starting is always the hard part. So what I often hear is people just wing it. They try to imitate what they think a radio talk show host would do and see how it goes. Let's see if we can put a little more structure and science to that in this video, What Should I Say in My First Podcast? In our series, How to Start a Podcast. I'm Mike Carruthers. Let's start at the very beginning. It has become convention for many podcasters to start each podcast with a slate or a billboard, such as, "This is the Bob Smith Technology Podcast, Episode 23, Reviews of New Tablets." It's a good idea in that it allows for quick audio identification of the episode. Of course, there are other ways to identify the episode by file name and by written title, so the billboard is certainly optional. But if you're going to do it, you should do it from the start and be consistent. Next, it's a good idea to have some sort of opening music or produced open with an announcer that indicates the beginning of your podcast. We've talked about the importance of incorporating other sound, and here is the perfect example. Just make sure you have the rights to the music you use. There's plenty of free music or music you can buy for a one-time payment of literally just a few dollars. Just Google production music or royalty-free music, and you will find sources. So the music plays, the opening finishes, and it's your turn to talk. So what do you say? Well, on the first podcast, I would suggest you introduce yourself and your podcast briefly, maybe 30 seconds, and acknowledge it is your first podcast, and then dive into your topic. I would not spend a lot of time talking about yourself at the beginning of the first podcast. Why? From the moment a listener starts listening, he or she is waiting to hear what's in it for them, and they won't wait very long. We know this from radio research. Once people hear what's in it for them and become invested in you and your podcast, then they might want to know more about you. And it's good to reveal things about yourself. But you don't need to do it all at once in the first podcast. While it's not a perfect analogy, it makes the point. When you read a magazine or newspaper article, it never starts out with, "Hi, I'm Bob Jones. I'll be your author for this article as I sit here in my office where the sun is shining." The article just starts. People want to know what's in it for them. You want to grab people and draw them in as soon as possible because the clock is ticking. People are waiting to find out if this podcast is interesting to them. And if they don't hear it soon, they're going to leave. So get to the interesting part as quick as you can. Ask a question or make a provocative statement. Say something that will engage the listener early. Now, let me take a little pressure off. Your first podcast is likely going to be one of your least listened to podcasts, and the only way you're going to get good at this is to get started. Take a shot at it. Once you've tried to make a podcast, these videos will probably mean a lot more to you. Also, it's a good idea to post at least 2 or 3 podcasts initially, not just one. That way you don't have just one podcast hanging out there all by itself. You have 2 or 3 to start. It looks more substantial. And secondly, if you promote your initial podcasts, 3 will generate more buzz than 1. And you are more likely to get into the iTunes New and Noteworthy section, which can give you a nice little bump in listeners. So to review what to say in your first podcast, first of all, decide if you're going to do an opening billboard or not and be consistent one way or the other. Have some sort of opening music or production music with an announcer. Introduce yourself, but don't tell your life story. Understand that every listener is waiting to hear what's in it for them, so get to the point quickly. Engage your listeners by giving them something to think about early and often. Now, that should help you structure your first podcast. Please check out the other videos in this series, How to Start a Podcast. I'm Mike Carruthers. Thanks for watching.